The chandeliers of Almack's assembly rooms glimmered like a constellation suspended just above the heads of London's finest, casting their cold, pristine light across a floor polished so thoroughly that it reflected every slippered step like an accusation. Into this ruthless brightness walked Lady Eleanor Ashcombe, her gloved hands folded with care, her posture so composed it nearly concealed the tremor in her breath. She had known, upon accepting marriage to the Duke of Harrington, that society would judge her. What she had not anticipated was that they would stalk her like wolves scenting a weakening limb. Tonight, however, they did not merely scent weakness, they swallowed it with relish. She moved forward with the grace of someone who knew she was being studied and refused to falter. Her gown, though modest compared to the sparkling silks fluttering around her, traced her figure with quiet dignity. She wished for invisibility, yet every whisper seemed to swell as she passed, each one sharpened by malicious delight. A cluster of debutantes leaned together near the refreshment table, fans fluttering like wings of brightly colored birds. One released a high, tinkling laugh, a sound designed to appear innocent, yet heavy with intent. "Entrapped him, so they say," she murmured to her companions, loud enough for Eleanor to hear. A viscount's daughter with empty coffers does not often rise to a duchess's rank without encouragement. Eleanor felt the whisper strike her like a slap, though she refused to allow any sign of pain to crease her expression. The rumor had reached her the day before, vague, impossible, absurd, and yet here it was, spoken as though it were truth carved in stone. She paused near the edge of the ballroom, pretending to examine the floral arrangements, though she saw none of them. She had been raised to understand the fragility of reputation, but she had not fully appreciated how swiftly it could be destroyed. Her father's debts had certainly made the Ashcombe name less desirable, but never had she imagined they would become a weapon wielded against her. A gentleman she vaguely recognized approached, bowing stiffly. She extended her hand out of habit, offering a polite, steady smile. Instead of taking it, he hesitated, withdrew, and bowed again in hollow courtesy before turning away without a word. His rejection was more pointed than an insult spoken aloud. Eyes around the room followed the exchange with avid satisfaction, their judgment thick enough that Eleanor felt it cling to her like a shroud. Even the music, normally her refuge, felt distant and brittle. The narrator of her fate, had there been one present, might have noted that in Regency London, humiliation was not loud. It was quiet, elegant, and performed beneath chandeliers. It was folded into the lift of a brow, the withdrawal of a hand, the stifled laugh behind a fan. And tonight, Eleanor bore the full weight of this refined cruelty. She forced herself to move again, crossing the room with the fragile deliberation of a figure walking through glass. Her husband's absence made everything worse. Since their marriage ceremony, so swift it seemed like a negotiation rather than a union, the Duke had remained cordial but distant, bound more by duty than desire. His home had welcomed her, he had not. Eleanor had hoped he might appear at her side tonight, even out of obligation, to signal that the union was legitimate and stable. But he was nowhere to be seen, and without him, she was prey among the glittering hunters. The matron nearest her suddenly leaned forward, voice pitched just high enough to ensure audibility. Her family's accounts were, how shall one say, altered. Quite artfully. Her companion gasped with a mixture of horror and delight. Eleanor felt the blood leave her cheeks. A forged document, that was the lie currently circulating. That she had trapped a duke by presenting false financial records. It was ridiculous, but the Tun cared little for plausibility when scandal was involved. Eleanor's vision blurred slightly, and she steadied herself with a subtle shift of her foot. She wanted to flee, yet knew that doing so would confirm their suspicions. A lady's composure was her only armor, and tonight hers was cracking under relentless scrutiny. Then a hush swept across the ballroom, a sudden, almost reverent quiet. Fans paused mid-flutter. Conversations stuttered. The orchestra faltered for an instant before regaining its rhythm. Eleanor did not need to turn to know the cause. She felt it first as a shift in the air, a sensation like the tightening of strings before a crescendo. The Duke of Harrington had arrived. He entered with the imposing elegance that had made him a figure of fascination since he'd inherited the title. Tall, impeccably dressed, and carved from a restraint so rigid it resembled marble. He surveyed the room as if he owned not merely the building but every soul within it. His dark hair caught the chandelier's glow, and his expression, always solemn, carried a shadow of preoccupation. Several mothers straightened immediately, nudging their daughters into more flattering postures. Eleanor fought the instinct to shrink. She did not know whether he had heard the rumor. She feared discovering his reaction. Would he keep his distance? Would he allow the whispers to flourish? Would he confirm them with his silence? Instead, his gaze found her instantly, as though he had expected her exact location the moment he stepped through the doors. His eyes, sharp and controlled, softened for a fraction of a second. Then he walked toward her. The room parted with the reverence reserved for royalty. Every step he took was measured, deliberate, echoing faintly on the polished floor like the countdown to judgment. Eleanor's heart beat painfully as he reached her. He did not bow. He did not offer a formal greeting. He simply reached for her hand. She froze. Then, before she could breathe, before society could blink, he pulled her gently yet firmly toward him and placed a kiss upon her lips. It was not a chaste kiss. It was not theatrical. It was lingering, steady, warm, certain. Gasps rippled like wind through silk. A lady dropped her fan. A gentleman muttered a curse of disbelief. The musicians missed several notes. Eleanor felt the world tilt, not from fear, but from shock so profound it swept through every bone in her body. When he finally drew back his forehead brushed hers briefly, a gesture more intimate than the kiss itself. "You are not alone," he murmured, too quietly for anyone but her to hear. Her breath caught. Her heart, long constrained by propriety and uncertainty, fluttered like something newly freed. With his hand still linked to hers, he guided her forward, away from the line of staring faces, as though shielding her with nothing but his presence. Whispers chased behind them astonishment, envy, confusion, but they no longer felt like claws. The humiliation that had crushed her moments earlier began to dissolve, replaced by something she dared not name. They paused at the edge of the ballroom, where shadows softened the harsh glow. He did not look at her immediately. He surveyed the room once more, ensuring every eye had witnessed what he intended them to see. Only then did he whisper, "This ends tonight." Eleanor opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, he gently pressed her hand. "Walk with me," he said, voice calm yet edged with something uncharacteristically raw. And though uncertainty swirled within her, she found herself stepping beside him, sensing that whatever came next would alter far more than her reputation. The carriage ride home after Almax passed in a silence so taut it felt like a veil stretched between them, fragile and shimmering. Neither Eleanor nor the Duke spoke, though the city outside hummed with the remnants of the evening. Carriages rumbling over cobblestones, lanterns flickering in shop windows, the muted laughter of late stragglers lingering near taverns. Eleanor kept her gaze pinned to her gloved hands, which lay folded in her lap with deliberate stillness, but her heart still beat with the echo of the kiss he had given her. It clung to her like the lingering warmth of a fire, impossible to ignore. She wondered whether it had been duty or strategy, whether he regretted such boldness, whether he even remembered the way their breaths had mingled afterwards. When they arrived at Harrington House, the Duke stepped out first, offering his hand with a politeness so controlled it almost disguised the slight tension in his jaw. Eleanor accepted the gesture, trying to gather her thoughts into some coherent shape. The servants greeted them with respectful bows, but she sensed curiosity beneath their courtesy. Perhaps news had already reached them. Perhaps the ballroom had already become a furnace of eager tongues. The moment she stepped into the drawing room, the Duke's voice broke the silence, low yet certain. "I should not have left you to face such cruelty alone." She turned, startled by the admission. He rarely spoke of fault, never his own. "You could not have known what would occur." "I should have anticipated it," he countered. "The tongue delights in devouring what it cannot comprehend. And you," he paused, as though measuring the next words, "you have given them no scandal to feed upon. So they fabricate one." Eleanor felt a quiet shock at the unexpected defense. spoken with more heat than she had ever heard from him. Before she could reply, he crossed the room and reached for a book that lay upon a nearby table. It was old, its leather binding softened by use, its spine etched with gold filigree worn pale from age. He offered it to her without ceremony. "This is for you," he said. She stared at the volume in confusion. When she opened it, her breath faltered. It was a treatise on medieval astronomy, written in Latin, densely annotated, rare enough that only scholars or collectors would possess a copy. She had mentioned the subject only once, in an offhand remark during dinner 2 weeks earlier. She had believed he had not heard her at all. "How did you find this?" she whispered. His gaze held hers steadily. "I have resources. You may find comfort in familiar interests." He hesitated before adding, "I thought it might please you." Emotion swelled in her chest, unexpected and unwelcome in its intensity. She lowered her eyes, tracing the edges of the book with trembling fingers. "Thank you," she murmured, unable to shape anything more articulate. Before the moment could deepen, a footman entered with a small silver tray. "A letter for her grace," he said. Eleanor accepted it, surprised by the elegant script on the envelope. It bore no seal. When she opened it, a faint scent of crushed lavender drifted up, a fragrance she recognized far too well. The message inside was simple, but its implications made her stomach clench. "The truth is not buried. There will be proof soon. Prepare yourself." No signature. No mark. Only the accusation breathing like smoke from the page. The Duke noticed her stillness. "What is it?" She handed him the note. His expression, usually so composed, hardened swiftly. "Who delivered this?" "The servant found it near my reticule," she answered. "It must have been placed there tonight." He folded the paper with precise, controlled movements. "Someone intends to resurrect the rumor with greater force." Her throat tightened. "What shall we do?" "Remain composed. And vigilant." There was no hesitation in his tone, no uncertainty. "Whoever orchestrates this believes your resolve is fragile. We must give them reason to doubt their conclusion." His confidence steadied her, though unease continued to churn beneath her ribs. Still clutching the astronomy text, she followed him into the hallway, where the faint sounds of servants settling into the night faintly echoed. The house, though grand and impeccably kept, felt strangely watchful, as though the walls themselves sensed the shifting tension between them. 2 days later, they attended a garden party hosted by a minor baroness whose estate boasted rose groves so elaborate they appeared like labyrinths carved from living silk. Eleanor arrived on the Duke's arm, though she sensed his lingering frustration that they were forced into public so soon after the scandal. Yet it was necessary. Retreating would mean surrender. The guests greeted them with a courtesy more cautious than warm. Eleanor felt eyes drifting toward her, curiosity mingled with suspicion. She held her posture upright, recalling the Duke's words, "Remain composed." While crossing a narrow stone bridge spanning a koi pond, a sudden gust of wind tugged at her sleeve. Before she could react, the threatening note she had forgotten she'd tucked there slipped free and fluttered to the ground. A young woman, sharp-eyed and swift, snatched it up, her expression brightening with predatory triumph. Wordless, she handed it to the matron beside her, who read it with slow, deliberate relish. An icy wave of dread washed over Eleanor. The Duke, witnessing the exchange from across the path, moved toward her with a firm, unhurried stride that commanded immediate attention. He reached her side just as whispers began to ripple outward like cracks spreading across glass. "Walk with me," he said softly. She did. As they reached the central garden, the orchestra began a waltz, gentle, poised, inviting. Without warning, the Duke turned to her and extended his hand. She blinked, stunned. He had never requested a dance from her before. His voice, when he spoke, carried warmth beneath its polished edge. "May I?" Her heart stumbled. "Yes," she breathed. They moved into the dance with elegant precision, their steps aligned, their fingers interlaced with subtle pressure. Eleanor felt an unfamiliar ease unfurl within her, a moment suspended between what she feared and what she wished could be true. Their eyes met, and she saw in him something she had not recognized before. Not coldness, not distance, but a guarded tenderness struggling to surface. As the music swelled, the Duke leaned closer and whispered, "They seek to shame you so you may fracture. Do not give them that satisfaction." The words touched her more deeply than she expected. Before she could answer, a footman appeared at the edge of the dance floor, bowing urgently. "Your Grace," he said, "something has occurred at Harrington House." The Duke's jaw tightened. "What has occurred?" The servant swallowed. "Your study, sir. It has been disturbed." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. The music continued, blind to the shift in the air. The Duke met her gaze, eyes dark with a determination so fierce it raised gooseflesh along her arms. "We return at once," he said. And with those words, the fragile calm shattered, replaced by a foreboding that promised the night was far from over. The carriage lurched through the narrow London streets with a swiftness Eleanor had rarely experienced, the lanterns outside blurring into streaks of amber light that flickered across the Duke's features. He sat opposite her, posture rigid, jaw set with an intensity that seemed carved from stone. Not once did he glance away from the window, as though anticipating danger might materialize from the passing shadows. Eleanor clutched the astronomy book he had gifted her, its weight suddenly comforting, grounding her in the midst of a growing storm she barely understood. When they reached Harrington House, the front door already stood open, servants gathered anxiously in the hall. The butler bowed but could not conceal his disquiet. "Your Grace, the disturbance is contained, but we believed it best to refrain from touching anything." "Show me," the Duke commanded, his voice low, controlled, and unmistakably dangerous. He strode ahead, and Eleanor followed closely, feeling the tension coil tighter with every step. The corridor leading to his study smelled faintly of extinguished candles and overturned paper. When he pushed open the door, the sight within stole her breath. Books lay scattered across the carpet, drawers yanked open and dumped unceremoniously, and his mahogany desk bore fresh scratches as though someone had clawed through it in desperation. A single candle still burned near the corner, casting long, wavering shadows that made the disarray appear almost alive. But what held Eleanor's eyes was the sheet of parchment placed deliberately in the center of the desk. Drawn in dark, heavy strokes was her family's crest, crossed through with a jagged slash. Her hand pressed instinctively to her chest. "Someone did this to shame me," she whispered. The Duke lifted the parchment, his fingers tightening at the edges until the paper curled. "Someone wants far more than your humiliation," he murmured. "They want division between us. And they expect me to believe you are a liability." She swallowed hard. "Do you?" His head snapped toward her, eyes burning with something fierce. "No." The single word struck her with more force than any declaration he could have given. Yet beneath the reassurance lay a deeper question she could not suppress, one that had festered quietly since their wedding. "Then why defend me so fiercely if you have kept yourself at such a distance?" A breath of silence fell between them, heavy, fragile. He set the parchment down and turned fully toward her. The candlelight softened his features, revealing the exhaustion etched around his eyes. "Because distance is not disbelief," he said. "And because your ruin would be mine." She blinked, unsettled by the mixture of practicality and something unspoken beneath his words. "Is that the only reason?" He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of vulnerability. "You misjudge me if you believe I protect only for appearances." His voice lowered. "You are not the first woman in this house to suffer at society's hands." A soft, stunned quiet enveloped the room. Eleanor stepped closer, compelled by the rawness she sensed emerging through the cracks of his composure. "What happened?" He hesitated, turning away slightly, as though wrestling with memories long buried. Finally, in a restrained murmur, he said, "My mother." He rested his hand on the back of a chair, gripping it as though anchoring himself. She was gentle, brilliant, and unprepared for the cruelty that thrives in ballrooms. Lies spread about her as easily as perfume. They accused her of improprieties, of madness, of forging social alliances through deceit. His jaw tightened. My father believed some of it. He withdrew his affection. She died before I was grown. Eleanor felt her breath catch. She had heard nothing of this. Society spoke only of the Duke's lineage, not its sins. I am so sorry, she whispered. He turned back to her, his eyes shadowed but steady. I vowed never to allow another woman under my protection to be destroyed by whispers. His voice trembled almost imperceptibly. But that vow made me cold. It made me cautious. And it made me blind to how alone you have been. Her throat tightened. The room seemed to shrink around them, pulling them into a shared gravity. I never sought grand attention, she confessed. Books were my company. Silence was my comfort. But marriage has made me visible in ways I do not know how to bear. He stepped toward her, not abruptly, but with the deliberate gentleness of someone approaching a frightened bird. You should not bear it alone. His hand lifted, pausing near her cheek as though seeking permission. When she did not retreat, he brushed his fingers against her skin, tracing a line so careful it felt reverent. The contact sent a tremor down her spine, awakening a warmth she had not allowed herself to imagine. His voice deepened to a whisper that carried more truth than any vow he had spoken on their wedding day. You are not alone, Eleanor. Not while I draw breath. Emotion surged through her, fragile yet overwhelming. Her breath mingled with his, their closeness too intimate, too vulnerable. For a moment, the chaos of the study disappeared. All that existed was the space between them, charged, delicate, trembling. She lifted her hand, barely touching the fabric of his coat, and he leaned closer, closing the distance inch by inch. His breath warmed her lips. His gaze searched hers with quiet urgency, as though asking a question he had never dared voice. But just as their lips were about to meet, a sharp knock cracked through the moment. Both froze. The door opened a fraction, and a maid curtsied quickly. Forgive the intrusion, Your Grace. But a message was delivered to the back entrance. The sender insisted it was urgent. She held out another sealed letter, this one bearing a familiar lavender scent. Eleanor's heart dropped. She accepted the envelope with trembling fingers, recognizing instantly the same fragrance that had haunted the previous warning. The seal was unmarked. She unfolded the paper. If you wish to protect yourself, meet me alone. Midnight. At the old conservatory behind Grosvenor Square. Her breath faltered. Beneath the message, a single flourish marked the paper. Selina. The name burned through her. A former family friend. A woman known for ambition disguised as elegance. A woman who had once adored the Duke's attention, before his engagement to Eleanor had shattered her pride. Eleanor swallowed, turning the paper so the Duke could see. His expression darkened with immediate recognition. She dares, he said, voice dangerously low. She wants to speak with me, Eleanor murmured. Alone. No, he answered instantly. But Eleanor lifted her chin, a quiet resolve beginning to form. She may reveal what she knows. And we cannot continue blind. He stepped closer, voice firm. You will not face her alone. I will not allow. She gently touched his arm, stopping him. Let me hear what she has to say. A storm brewed behind his eyes, but he said nothing. The silence between them pulsed, filled with fear, defiance, and something growing deeper. The clock in the hallway chimed the hour, its echo stretching through the house like a warning. Eleanor folded the letter. Midnight approached. The days following their reconciliation unfolded with a softness Eleanor scarcely dared to trust, as though fate itself walked on quiet feet, unwilling to disturb the tentative peace forming between them. Harrington became a presence that steadied rather than overshadowed, appearing beside her not merely as the man the world expected him to be, but as someone who had chosen, with deliberate intent, to understand her. She found him waiting outside her morning room with a casual remark about the weather that carried more meaning than the sky above. She caught him watching her during dull visits with society matrons, offering the smallest tilt of his head that said she need only give a sign and he would remove her from their tiresome company. Such gestures were modest in appearance yet monumental in effect, for each dismantled a brick in the wall she had built between them, a wall she had believed duty required her to maintain. He, for his part, seemed newly aware that she observed him more keenly than before, and his guarded composure gave way, bit by bit, to moments of sincerity he no longer attempted to hide. If he reached to take her cloak, his fingers lingered half a breath longer. If she spoke with uncharacteristic boldness, he did not silence her but encouraged her, as though he counted her newfound confidence among his quiet victories. Still, the memory of her humiliation at Almack's did not loosen its grip so easily. She could walk through a drawing-room without hearing the precise words whispered that night, yet they echoed within her, clinging like a stain she feared no audience could fully forget. The Tun, so skilled at faux benevolence, now greeted her with smiles that revealed too little, as though waiting to see whether the Duchess who had once been their entertainment might stumble again for their amusement. Eleanor suspected some wished precisely for that fall. But Harrington, despite his calm restraint, was finely attuned to the undercurrents swirling around them. Whenever a remark brushed against cruelty, he shifted imperceptibly closer, his presence a shield no insult dared approach too boldly. The more he stepped forward, the more she realized how deeply he had been holding himself back throughout their marriage, not from lack of feeling but from a lifetime taught that emotion was a weakness, that affection should hide behind propriety lest it be used against him. And the more she saw this truth in him, the more she craved to offer him something in return, some courage of her own, freely given, not born of obligation but of devotion slowly, undeniably growing. Their unspoken bond faced its first true test during a dinner at Lady Redford's, whose fondness for scandal was matched only by her talent for arranging it. Eleanor felt the familiar weight of speculation the moment she entered the room, though she carried herself with the serene discipline she had cultivated during the worst of the rumors. Yet as the evening progressed, it became clear that Lady Redford had coordinated the seating to place Eleanor opposite a gentleman who had, weeks earlier, been among the loudest voices mocking her supposed deception. He greeted her with a bow dipped too low to be sincere, and a smile that hovered on the edge of insolently amused. Harrington saw it, she knew he did, for his expression cooled like winter glass. But she laid a hand lightly on his sleeve, just enough to request patience, and he inclined his head in silent respect. It was the first moment she felt the balance between them shift. She was not merely someone he protected but someone whose judgment he trusted. When the gentleman attempted a veiled insult during the soup course, a remark about how swiftly certain ladies seemed to ascend the ranks of society, Eleanor did not shrink. Instead, she looked him steadily in the eye and replied in a voice soft yet edged with steel that not every rise was a deception, but some descents were certainly earned through pettiness. Laughter sparkled around the table in a ripple that clearly favored her, and the gentleman's smirk dissolved. Harrington's gaze flickered to her with unmistakable admiration, though he said nothing, for silence spoke more eloquently in that moment than any declaration. After dinner, he drew her aside into a small alcove near the conservatory, his expression both proud and somber, as though her strength had pierced him in ways he had not anticipated. He lifted her hand with a gentleness that contradicted the power in his frame, and whispered that he had never imagined a partner who could stand not behind him but beside him with such quiet authority. For an instant she thought he might kiss her, there beneath the dim light and the faint scent of roses drifting in from the hothouse, but he simply held her fingers to his cheek and breathed her name like a confession. The final test came the following week, when an invitation arrived for a charity fete held on the Harrington estate grounds, a tradition his mother had began decades earlier, well attended, highly scrutinized, and certain to gather every eye that once delighted in Eleanor's misfortune. She hesitated before answering, unsure whether she wished to place herself at the center of such observation. Yet the Duke, seeing her uncertainty, told her in a tone sincere and without pressure that the decision belonged wholly to her. He would accompany her or decline the invitation without question. It was the gentlest thing he had ever offered. She realized then that avoiding the world would not unmake her shame, nor would silence defend her dignity. She must step into that world anew, not to prove herself to those who fed upon gossip, but to show herself who she had become. And so she agreed, not with fear's trembling whisper, but with a calm anchored in the memory of his hand lifting hers to his cheek. The day of the fete dawned clear and bright, sunlight striking the manor's windows until they gleamed like shields. Eleanor chose a gown that reflected none of the season's garish fashions, but one that suited her nature, soft, graceful, dignified. When she descended the staircase, Harrington waited at the bottom, his eyes widening, though his voice remained steady when he said she looked precisely as a duchess ought, not dazzling, not ostentatious, but unquestionably sovereign. The words warmed her far more deeply than flattery could. They walked out together onto the lawns, where guests gathered in clusters that shifted like murmuring birds. But as conversations paused and dozens of faces turned toward her, Eleanor found that the old terror no longer clutched her lungs. Harrington's hand rested lightly at her back, a silent vow that she would not face another humiliation alone. When Lady Redford approached with a smile stretched thin as spun sugar, ready perhaps to test whether Eleanor still possessed the fragile composure of her debut, the Duke stepped forward before the woman uttered a word. He said, in a voice precise and resonant enough for every nearby guest to hear, that the Duchess had shown more grace under false accusation than most possessed in comfort, and he trusted that any further conversation would reflect this truth. There was no threat in his tone, yet its authority rang unmistakably. Eleanor felt every pair of eyes shift, not with mockery, but with something closer to reluctant respect. They moved together, not with the polished precision society expected but with a harmony that felt organic, instinctive, as though their steps were guided by a rhythm that had long waited for its moment to surface. When the final note hung suspended in the air, Harrington leaned toward her, not with theatricality, not with the startling boldness of that night at Almack's, but with a tenderness so unguarded it drew a hush from all who watched. He pressed his forehead gently to hers, his breath soft against her skin, and whispered that he had never imagined a marriage forged for duty could become the one thing he wished to protect above all else. Eleanor did not answer immediately. She let the truth of his words settle between them, felt the world's judgment fall away like dust. Then, with a courage born from both pain and healing, she whispered that affection need not be born perfect to be real, nor beginnings unflawed to lead to something worthy. And in that quiet exchange, beneath the open sky and within the gaze of a world that had once reveled in her disgrace, the Duchess and the Duke sealed not a performance of unity but the first true moment of a partnership they had both longed for in silence. The applause that rose around them was genuine, but it was the look in Harrington's eyes that anchored her, a look free of distance, free of obligation, a look that promised he would never again allow her to face the world without him beside her. But it was Harrington who surprised her most. As the musicians began a gentle country dance, he turned to her and asked, quietly yet without hesitation, whether she would grant him the first set. It was a gesture laden with meaning. A duke rarely opened a public event dancing with his own wife unless he wished to make a statement impossible to ignore. When she placed her hand in his, the warmth that passed between them steadied her more surely than any applause.